So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 8th lecture of our series on 20th century German language literature and the others of modernity. We're glad to have you with us tonight, especially in these uncertain times when the world outside feels somewhat unstable and intellectual work often feels fragile. It is precisely this kind of scholarly engagement that allows us to maintain a sense of continuity, reflection, and shared inquiry. Over the past weeks, our series has explored how 20th century German language literature engages with the social, cultural, and political complexities of modern life. We've asked how literature not only reflects the dominant ideologies of modernity, but actively interrogates and reshapes them. The guiding premise of our inquiry has been that modernity's others, its marginalized subjects, silenced languages, and repressed experiences, are not external to the modern project, but constitutive of it. Through readings of key literary texts and diverse cultural case studies, we've traced how modernity generates, incorporates, and contests forms of difference, ethnic, gendered, linguistic, territorial, and ideological. It is a particular honor to continue our series this evening with Professor Michal ben Horin, whose work exemplifies these questions in a rich and interdisciplinary way. Michal ben Horin is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Bar-Ilan University, specializing in German and modern Jewish literature in their historical contexts, with a particular focus on the intersection of music and literature. She earned her PhD from Tel Aviv University and completed postdoctoral fellowships at the Franz Rosenzweig Minerva Research Center at the Hebrew University, the University of Haifa, and the Zentrum für Literatur und Kulturforschung in Berlin. She was also a research fellow at the Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. From 2017 to 2022, she served as chair of the Department of Comparative Literature at Bar-Ilan University. Her publications include the 2016 book Musical Biographies, The Music of Memory in Post-1945 German Literature, and Reading the Voices, Musical Poetics Between German and Hebrew, published in 2022. Her current recent project, supported by a grant from the Israel Science Foundation, focuses on the bilingual poetry of Tuvia Ribner. Tonight's lecture, titled Reading Ingeborg Bachmann in Israel, centers on Bachmann's prose of the 1970s. In her autobiographical sketch, Biographisches, Bachmann evokes a mythical multilingual homeland, an echo of the lost Habsburg Empire that serves as a poetic counter to the nationalist logic of exclusion and homogenization. Professor Ben Horin will first explore how Bachmann's work resists the patriarchal and political structures of post-war society. The second part of the lecture turns to the Israeli reception of Bachmann's writing, focusing on Anna Maria Jokl and Ruth Almog, thereby extending our inquiry into modernity's others beyond Europe and beyond German language. So please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Michal ben Horin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariel, and I really I really appreciate this generous invitation to participate in this wonderful lecture series, and also to be able to share my thoughts with you. I'm also grateful to the Bucerius Center, Amir, and the team for the excellent really organization and support. I would like to open with a few remarks regarding my topic, the topic of my lecture. I first began engaging with Ingeborg Bachmann's prose in the context of exploring the relationship between literature and music. Over time, my research expanded to include other authors, focusing on the connections between German and Hebrew literature, both in Europe and in Israel. And yet Bachmann's work continued to intrigue me, compelling me to return to it. But how? How do we return to literary works we have previously read? From what standpoint? And within what framework or corpus do we approach them again? In recent months, these questions have become increasingly pressing for me, and I hope that despite the preliminary nature of my current inquiry, today's discussion will offer some meaningful insights and contribute to our shared exploration. And maybe I now put my my PowerPoint. Let's see if I can find it. Okay, I have to do you see it now? Okay. Good. Okay. So I'll just start reading out, and hopefully we'll have in the second part of this session questions and feedbacks and a nice conversation. Bachmann was born in 1926 in Klagenfurt, a town in the southeastern Austrian province of Carinthia, almost a decade after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the wake of the First World War. A path-breaking post-war Austrian poet, playwright, and prose writer, Bachmann played a major role in shaping the German literary discourse after the Second World War. Scholars, and I'm quoting here Dagmar Lorenz, for instance, often highlight Bachmann's pioneering role in problematizing the enduring impact of pervasive authoritarian racist structures, the much-debated phenomenon of everyday fascism in post-Shoah Central Europe. Raised and educated during the Nazi era, her father's school teacher was a member of the Austrian Nazi Party. Bachmann witnessed the total invalidation of everything she and her peers had been taught when the occupying forces introduced Western-style democracy and exposed the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. Troubled by the Austrian public's ongoing denial and its embrace of the official narrative portraying Austria as the first victim of National Socialism, Bachmann grew increasingly alienated from the literary culture of post-war Vienna. In 1953, shortly before the publication of her first poetry collection, she moved to Rome, where she would live until her death 20 years later. I argue that Bachmann's literature in German portrays a polyphonic model that reverberates, albeit critically, with her mythical image of the Habsburg Empire. This nostalgic, multicultural, and multilingual imagination challenges the monolithic narrative of the modern nation-state grounded in ethnic homogeneity, erasure of diversity, and the exclusion of others. In her literary work, Bachmann gives names to these others by testifying to their vulnerability and suffering from political and gender oppression. She points to roots of escape, which are nonetheless inseparable from various ways of dying. I will demonstrate this in the first part of my talk, focusing on Bachmann's prose works, such as her novel Malina, published in 1971, and her story collection Simultan. I then move to prose work in German and in Hebrew by two women writers in Israel who refer to Bachmann's poetic legacy in their own literary text. Anna Maria Jokl's Essenzen from 1993 and Ruth Almog's Zara Gan Eden, Stranger in Paradise from 2008. By reading these works in parallel, I aim to explore how literature, both within and beyond the geographical boundaries, can offer critical frameworks for engaging with violence and articulating strategies for addressing trauma. In an autobiographical essay, Bachmann recalls the time spent in her youth in the Gaeltail. This valley in Carinthia, from where her father originated, was not far from the crossroads of Italy, Slovenia, and Austria. Bachmann's recollection evokes an image of a mythical homeland transcending borders of language and culture. After the war, she moved to Vienna, a second homeland on the border now between East and West, and between a great past and a dark future. Throughout the years during which she traveled to Paris and London, Germany and Italy, in her own memory, the road between this valley and Vienna was still the longest. Moreover, whereas the past relates to the nostalgic myth of the Habsburg Empire, the future is haunted by the historical catastrophe of the Second World War and the annexation of Austria by the Nazis in 1938. Bachmann reflected on this in an interview. There was a specific moment in my childhood, the march of Hitler's troops into Klagenfurt. It was so horrible that on that day my memory begins. This monstrous brutality, this roaring, singing and marching, the emergence of my fear of death, the whole army entered into our tranquil, peaceful Carinthia. Whether or not this personal recollection is invented, scholars are controversial about it. Bachmann's illustration of that day, my memory begins, became an integral part of her poetics. The young girl's first encounter with the Nazi troops that ruined her childhood, a pastoral crossroad of Germanic, Slavic, and Roman cultures, is reconstructed as a traumatic event through the homogeneous, even homophonic sound of collective roaring, singing, and marching. According to Dagmar Lawrence again, in Manners of Death, her last and most controversial project, Bachmann articulates the war suspicions and fears about the far-reaching legacy of post-national socialist Germany and Austria in the form of an economic and cultural world order that encourages homogeneity and shuns diversity. Bachmann's work is replete with instances of abuse of the weaker group by the stronger, of people of color by whites, of the underprivileged by educated professionals, of women by men, of animals by humans. Regarding the controversies surrounding the equation of German fascism with the violence of interpersonal relations, Mark Anderson observes that for some readers, this comparison risks trivializing the gravity of actual Nazi war crimes. Others, however, argue that the roots of modern totalitarian states lie in specific historical, economic, and social conditions. Ultimately, Anderson concludes that when reading Bachmann's fiction, one must examine such analogies on a case-by-case basis, attending the insights they offer without the specific human stories being told. In 1966, Bachmann read an excerpt from Manners of Death in Hanover. But ever since, I was forced to realize that contrary to what we might like to believe, 1945 was not a date that gave us reason to suddenly sleep soundly at night. I have wondered where the quantum criminal activity, the latent murder, has remained. You should not infer from me this an attempt to escape the past. I just want to know what is happening now. And this is a book about the post-zero hour. Our literature finds to be daring at the expense of the past, but I have found out that it too is predicted upon a subliminal deception. Unwittingly, it concealed the dramas, the methods of murder at play here. Although Bachmann's Todesarten project was never completed, the hundreds of drafts she left behind reveal her distinctive approach to confronting both cultural and psychological destruction. As she articulated in a 1959 Frankfurter Vorlesungen, Literature must be a witness to crimes by giving voice to what has been denied or suppressed. In this sense, her writing testifies not only to the silent complicity of perpetrators, but also to the endured sufferings of victims who have been silenced. In 1967, Bachmann started to work on the novel Malina, which was published in 1971, the first and only part she completed from Manuals of Death. At the same time, she also worked on prose texts that appeared in 1972 in her second short story collection entitled Simultan. Despite the textual separation and differences between these works, they resemble each other structurally and deal with various ways of dying. The protagonist of Malina, a female character named I, cannot speak and obsessively writes letters which she later destroys. She moves in and out of lecture halls, hotel rooms, and cafes filled with hypocrisy and pretense before disappearing behind the walls of her home, from which nothing can ever be heard again. This I lives in 1960s Vienna with Malina, a figure who represents an aspect of her alter ego. She is surrounded by a society that suppresses the memory of fascism, both past and present, and remains silent about the violent persecution and systematic oppression of ethnic and gendered others. Gradually, the narrator withdraws from a world held hostage by an unending war, leaving behind a poetic testimony of a damaged life in a ruined home. This historical and psychological devastation is symbolically rendered through the fantasy of the House of Dream, das geräumte Haus. The expression the House of Austria has always been my favorite because it best explained my ties to Austria better than all the expressions at my disposal. I must have lived in this house at different times, as I can immediately call to mind the streets of Prague and the port of Trieste. I dream in Czech, in Windish, in Bosnian. I have always been at home in this house, and except while dreaming, without the slightest desire to inhabit the house of dreams. Bachmann shapes this critical trajectory through intense use of musical intertexts, such as Arnold Schoenberg's Biographisches from 1912. Schoenberg's melodrama is known for its experimental structure, demonstrating the composer's attempt to free himself from traditional tonality and conventional forms in order to better express the existence and experience of the mother subject. A central example is the Sprechgesang, a hybrid vocal mode between singing and speaking. And we can see this here in the example Bachmann combined in her text. This innovative compositional technique does not relinquish the semantic value of the text in favor of the sounds of melody. What it does is to replace the harmonic singing, bel canto, with this harmonic speech aesthetics that is closer to everyday language. In this regard, Bachmann's protagonist cannot sing the Exultate Jubilate by Mozart, associated with the beautiful book she can no longer write. Paradoxically, rather than this harmonic hybrid vocality between singing and speaking, is able to evoke the mythical image of plural, transcultural, and multilingual homeland. This nostalgic imagination is conveyed, for instance, through the legend on the mysteries of the princes of Abraham. Once upon a time, so Bachmann, there lived the princes of Chagre or Chagiran. Her retainers conferred among themselves and begged her to stay back, for the land along the Danube they had entered was ever in danger, and no borders yet existed, where later there would be Reisha, Marcomannia, Noricum, Misha, Dacia, Illyria, and Pannonia. Neither was there yet Sileitania or Transleitania, because the great migrations were still underway. As the legend unfolds, the princess meets a stranger who embodies, even if only implicitly, the Romanian Jewish poet and Holocaust survivor Porzelan. According to Israeli scholar Shimon Zanvan, Bachmann added this legend after Porzelan's death in April 1970 as an allegory of the impossible relationship in the wake of the historical catastrophe. Both poets met in Vienna in 1948 and developed a poetic and intimate relationship which was documented in a correspondence that continued until the 1960s. For our discussion, special attention should be given to the depiction of the stranger's voice in the novel. Deep into the night, she thought she heard a voice which did not speak but sang. It whispered and lulled, but then it stopped addressing strangers and sang only for her in a language which enthralled her, although she could not understand the word. Despite this, she knew this voice was meant for her alone and that it was calling to her. The princess did not need to understand the words. Enchanted, she arose and opened her tent onto the unending dark night of Asia. The first star she spied fell to the air. The use of musical phrases and allusions demonstrates acts of playing and listening through which the eye tries to return to an ideal nostalgic past. Old Austria reappears as a lost origin intertwined with the glorious plurality of the Habsburg monarchy. This paradox of longing for a lost imaginary past connected with Carinthia, and yet understanding that ultimately there is no way back, is repeated in variation throughout Bachmann's work. For example, in the novella Drei Wege zum See, Three Paths to the Lake, the main character is a successful news photographer who travels throughout the world documenting disasters and crises. The story begins with Elizabeth arriving at her father's house, but as in Malina, her attempt to reconciliation between the two fails. The three paths to the lake are the main metaphor for a lost-sealed pastime. Elizabeth tries time and again to find the paths she knew by heart as a child, but incapable of finding them, she gives up. Not only the place, global and local, but also the language is locked for Elizabeth. When swimming together in the lake, she tries to address her father, yet the only words that emerge from her mouth are in English and are perceived as empty signifiers by her father, who cannot understand any language but German. The loss of language is experienced also by her father, who mourns the occupation of Austria by the Germans. Bachmann's idealization of the Habsburg monarchy as an alternative to Nazi Germany and the confrontation of the German and Austrian pasts are reflected in the ambiguous relations to the mother tongue. These topics are explored throughout the entire story collection. Bachmann's female narrators are simultaneously alienated and long for their mother tongue, which also embodies a fear and worship of the symbolic father or the fatherland. The language therefore reveals the differences and gaps in the German as part of living with Austria's Nazi past and its legacy in the present. The story simultan, my final example, follows Nadia, who works as a translator for the United Nations. She is spending a few days in Italy with Ludwig, her new lover. They visit the Greek temples at Paestum and the Christ of Maretta, a colossal statue on the hills above the Calabrian village in which they are staying. Written in German, the text begins with fragments of foreign languages, Slavic and Italian. Soon the reader realizes that these transitions between the languages threaten Nadia's well-being. In contrast to her male lover, who lives in only one language, Nadia slowly experiences translation, her professional skill, as destructive. What a strange mechanism she was. She lived without a single thought of her own, immersed in the sentences of others like a sleepwalker, furnishing the same but different sounding sentences an instant later. She could make machen, fair, hacer, and gelat out of to make. She could spin each word to 6 different positions on a wheel. She just had to keep from thinking that to make really meant to make. Fair, gelat. That might put her head out of commission, and she did have to be careful not to get snowed under by an avalanche of words. In response, Nadia wishes for a shared language, Ursprache, based on stable meanings that demonstrate nostalgia for a place, a home, as opposed to her displaced expatriate existence. She longs for definitive meaning that will stop the deferral of meanings embedded in the linguist's slippages. This longing, however, underscores the violent denial of historical crimes. Rather, it exposes the patriarchal power and national authority from which she was trying to escape by living outside of Austria and distancing herself from its hegemonic culture. This becomes clear when Nadia, sitting next to her lover while facing the monument of the Christ of Mareta, imagines herself crashing into the abyss. All that was needed was to tread heavily or make a single careless movement, and that was why she was sitting as deep as possible, so that this cliff wouldn't crash down with both of them, and the poverty of the village and the descendants of the Saracens and all the heavy-laden stories of all those weary times. Bachmann intertwines the spiritual image of the Holy Redeemer and the earthly forgotten victims of the religious wars, such as the poor village people and the descendants of the Saracens. In so doing, she also recalls the role of the theological sign, the source of all the signs, and an extension of divine authority in the formation of modern national identity. Nadia's disease is symptomatic of the oppressive hegemonic culture that hides its theological source, a culture that rejects and erases differences in favor of the hegemonic sign. Similarly, the responsibility and complicity with the Nazi atrocities and persecution of the other is denied by the collective memory, which falsely celebrates its exclusive victimhood. The story ends with the Italian word auguri. Hopefully I pronounce it correctly. Giacomo will correct later. Nadia congratulates the hotel boy who has just finished watching the Giro d'Italia bicycle race on the TV. The roars of the fans crying the name of the winner, Adoni, perhaps evoke voices from other spectacles such as the Olympic Games in Berlin in 1936. Bachmann leaves the connotations in the minds of her readers when she writes how Nadia listened with horror and relief, and in these staccato cries heard all the staccato cries from all the cities and countries she had ever visited. As these examples show, Bachmann critically explores political and gender oppression by confronting the amnesia of the post-fascist and post-capitalist culture within which she lived. Apparently, the mythical image of a multicultural homeland contrasts the monolithic trajectory of the modern nation state. However, Bachmann's poetic texture rejects simple binary. The tragic fate of her female protagonist results from the utopian perspective associated with the contracts of the mythological homeland. What they long for cannot be fulfilled. In this sense, they reveal the danger of an obsessive engagement with the past in the wake of the collapse of the empire, while reflecting on the excluding structures of present post-World War II national narratives. Their traces seem to reappear in literary texts by women writers in Israel, while resonating in Bachmann's literary tradition in different cultural contexts. And now I move to the other examples. The first is Anna Maria Jokl, whose life was marked by a series of migrations shaped by political upheaval. Born in Vienna in 1911, while her grandparents lived in Breslau, she relocated to Berlin after her father's death in 1927, where she engaged in theater, journalism, and film. With the rise of the Nazi regime in 1933, she fled to Prague, joining the first wave of intellectual exiles. In 1939, following the occupation of Czechoslovakia, she escaped to London, where she worked extensively with refugee children and participated in immigrated cultural life. After the war, Jokl studied at the Karl Gustav Jung Institute in Zurich before returning to Berlin to practice psychotherapy. In 1965, she immigrated to Jerusalem, reflecting in retrospect. Here, I had the right of being at home. For better or worse, even if with heavy losses, I speak Hebrew quite well, but nothing is ever forgotten, nothing. One is everything that has been, the merging of all processes into simultaneity and new chemical elements. This reflection is part of the memoir published by Zoka in 1993, in which she reflected on her life experiences. Instead of the linear concept of time, Jokl refers to the multi-layered simultaneous figure of the Egyptian hieroglyph. Geographically registered, there were 6 lives, always at different focal points of our era. In chronological order, Vienna, Berlin, Prague, London, Berlin, Jerusalem. If each phase were a pane of glass, on each of which a special symbol were etched, all overlaid and seen from above in a single glance, a hieroglyph of our epoch might emerge. By pointing to specific encounters with various people she met while immigrating and running for her life, Jokl articulates the responsibility of bearing witness to different forms of suffering that are not identical and do not exclude each other. As you see, she tells in her letter, I did not experience the Holocaust firsthand, but it has never disappeared from consciousness as a constant condition, as a turning point that irreversibly changed the world, not only the Jewish one. It turned the unthinkable possibility at the center of consciousness into a reality that has since become repeatable without any threshold. Jokl's articulation of historical trauma underscores her view of the Holocaust not merely as a past event, but as an enduring psychic condition, an ever-present rupture shaping consciousness. This becomes evident in 2 stories she added in 1997 to the memoir called Death 1 and Death 2, perhaps an allusion to Bachmann's manner of death. The second story specifically refers to Bachmann's narrator and her lover Marina as a reflection of the relationship between Jokl's narrator and Jacob, Yaakov, a painter she met in Prague, having moved there from Berlin in the 1930s. They separated and met years later in London, and once more in Jerusalem, only to painfully realize their failure to reconnect. Similarly, Jokel's encounters with other refugees and migrants illuminate entangled catastrophes in the 20th century. Moreover, while referring to the First and Second World Wars, the Holocaust, a crisis outside Europe, such as those in Africa and the Middle East, her ethical reflections extend beyond a solely Jewish experience. One of these others on the threshold of West and East, but also German and Czech, Jewish and Catholic, male and female, is Otla, Franz Kafka's sister. Jokel's poetic testimony begins with research on Kafka that fails to acknowledge Otla's profound impact on her brother. First published in 1969 in Fats and in Hebrew in Molad, this story recounts Jokel's meeting with Otla during her move to Prague in 1933. A 1937 photograph Jokel took of Otla and her daughters was published in Fats in 1975. Following the release of Kafka's letters to his family, which revealed his close bond with Otla. After the war, Jokel searched for Otla and learned of her murder in Auschwitz from her daughters. Her memoir resonates with Otla's silenced, almost forgotten story, giving voice to the anonymous and enjoying them with names. Writing against censorship, both private and collective, culminates in a garish spectre, an unrelenting presence that seems to pierce consciousness with disturbing clarity. Here, the narrator, having recently immigrated to Israel, visits friends in Tel Aviv. A sudden change of plan brings her to a neighborhood near the road to Haifa, apparently referring to Shikun Bavli, built on the ruins of an Arab village. The histories of 48 and the wake of the catastrophe of 45 are not mentioned explicitly, but resonate with the tangible traumas haunting Jokel's memoir. Losing her way after stepping out for a cigarette, the narrator is pulled into a surreal nightmare. Her description evokes a traumatic moment embodied in the gap between past and present, unconscious, through or too early, and retrospective reflection, too late. And I quote, "I still wouldn't know how, but tomorrow, when the present had already become the past, I would say, yes, yesterday at this time, why that seems self-evident is hard to grasp afterwards. But I began to walk again. And I don't have enough time to deal with it now, the concept of trauma, but I've done it elsewhere. I'll just conclude this story and the part dealing with Jokel, that eventually the narrator finds her way back home to the building, only to realize that her hosts are wrapped in afternoon slumber. By transgressing the boundaries between waking and sleeping, awareness and blindness, Jokel critiques the dynamics of monolithic narrative and national discourse that remain blind to others. Another example is of Bachmann's reception in Israel is Ruth Almog's novel Stranger in Paradise, published in 2008. Born in 1936 in Petah Tikva to German Jewish physicians who emigrated from Hamburg to Prestate, Israel, Almog's work deals with the impact of the Holocaust not only on the first generation survivors but also on their children and grandchildren. In this novel, Almog questions the limits of national redemption narratives by introducing the present context by a horrific past, and by problematizing the lines between victim and victimizer. Almog's plot juggles three timelines: 1968, 1990, and 2004 until 2007. She also introduced two countries, Israel and Germany, while reflecting on central political and historical events: the rebellion of the 1968 generation, the post-war opening of the Stasi Records Archive, and post-reunification Germany, and the Suez Crisis, the first Intifada, and the Second Lebanon War in Israel. Rather than adhering to a linear progression from past to present and from calamity to revival, the narrative offers multidirectional memories that are interlinked throughout poetic continuity and intertextual connections. Seen in this slide, the Nazi genocide reverberates through, but does not compete with, the disasters of the 21st century. The novel pivots on the love-hate relationship between two women, one German and the other Israeli, and brings together various genres such as biography, fiction, prose, and poetry, imaginative dialogues and lexicon entries, alongside pictures of historical sites and illustrations from scientific books. This is an example how it looks like in Hebrew. There is no English translation. The woman's relationship resonates in multiple intertextual connections, including women poets from antiquity to the 20th century, such as the Neoplatonist philosopher Hypatia, the German Jewish poet Elsa Schiller, and the Austrian poet Ingeborg Bachmann. For instance, Patti, the narrator, is named after the famous Alexandrian philosopher. At some point, she and Andrea pay a visit to Wuppertal, Elberfeld, the birthplace of Lasker Schiller, who fled Nazi Germany to Switzerland in 1933 before settling in Jerusalem. Wuppertal is also the hometown of Patti's family of origin. During the visit, Patti imagines seeing her relatives outside the window of the city hall. These family members had in fact been sent to the Minsk ghetto and then murdered by the Nazis. Later in the novel, Andrea imagines herself as Ingeborg Bachmann. Almog is acutely aware of Bachmann's uncompromising literary treatment of Nazi atrocities and the way her literature illustrates modes of identification, among them the Holocaust survivor Porzellan. Moreover, whereas Hypatia lived and wrote and was persecuted in Alexandria, both Lasker Schiller, the Knight of Tino of Baghdad and Prince of Dubai, and Bachmann's uncompleted book of Franza evoke multi-layered imagination of Egypt. In this sense, Almog's cultural assemblage not only challenges the boundaries between Europe and the Middle East among Jews, Muslims, and Christians, but also interrogates the binary position of victim and perpetrator. The novel ends with Andrea's disappearance. Back in Tel Aviv, Patti writes in her diary, few words in Hebrew. כל השבוע היו שמי הלילה צהובים מאבק. ביום חמישי נרשמו בתל אביב 36 מעלות. פורים עדיין לא הגיע והשנה אינה שנה מוגרת. אני זוכרת היטב שבפורים ירד תמיד גשם זלעפות. האם השרב הזה, שנראה כל כך לא טבעי, מבשר פורים בשום. All week, the night skies were yellow with dust. On Thursday, temperature in Tel Aviv reached 36 degrees. Horin has not yet arrived. And this is not a leap year. I clearly remember that it always poured rain and falling for this heat wave, which feels so unnatural, the heart of the rain. Horin. In this diary, Almog's narrator writes about a lover who was killed in the Sinai campaign in 1956. This historical event evokes a more recent instance of violence and loss she now calls by name. The Second Lebanon War, which broke out in 2006 and which reminds one of the First Lebanon War. As one story does not exclude another, the whole is not confined to the past, to Europe alone, or to the first generation. Its impact extends to the second and third generations, and in doing so, it is haunting histories challenge the redemptive trajectory of dominant national narratives. Accordingly, the rain, perhaps a reference to the biblical flood that Almog wishes for at the end of her novel, seems to emphasize that coming to terms with the past is not yet possible. To conclude, this discussion showed Ingeborg Bachmann's poetic elaboration of the Habsburg Empire's mythical imagination in challenging the monolithic narrative of the modern nation state, which often excludes the other and erases internal diversity. In my talk, I focused on her prose work from the early 1970s that reflects on the impact of authoritarian and racist structures in post-Shoah Central Europe. The second part explored Bachmann's reception in Israel by focusing on Anna Maria Jokl and Ruth Almog. Writing in German and in Hebrew, respectively, the prose of these two writers resonates with Bachmann's critique of oppressive hegemonic structures across linguistic and cultural borders, thereby offering an insight into the issue of modernity's others beyond Europe and the German-speaking world. Okay, now the great challenge to
Well, first and foremost, thank you so much, Professor Ben Horin, for this deeply illuminating and interesting talk, and for offering such an original and thought-provoking comparative perspective that, brings Bachmann into dialogue with Israeli authors. And yes, we now have time for questions and discussion. So if you'd like to ask something, please feel free to do so.
any question would be great for me, just to, it helps me to think further on this project, which is really on its primary stages. And like, as I said,
Right.
in the beginning. So,
Okay, I think I can ask a question, right?
yeah.
Thank you so much, Michal. I really enjoyed how you. I mean, I'm not really familiar with Bachmann beyond Malina, so I was really interested in the story simultan that you mentioned. So I was wondering. Okay, so first of all, I was wondering how much is she influenced by Roth in the construction of this sort of Habsburg myth. First of all, that's a very kind of easy question, I guess. But then also, I was interested in how she uses antiquities. And by antiquity, I mean in the story from Simultan, she uses probably the temple in Paestum that you mentioned, but also in Malina, I think she mentions the various divisions of the Roman Empire, right? And so I was interested in knowing a little bit more about how this sort of nostalgia for, after all, a world that is gone, but her parents lived through it, meets an entire different world that is thousands of years away. If she gives more attention to one or to the other, if the citations that you pulled up are in a certain way representative, or instead are particular moments where the attention is heightened on these issues. And I would have more questions about Ruth Almog, but for now it seems like enough. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. So the first question dealt with the influence of what? I didn't understand the word that you meant.
Joseph Roth.
Oh, Joseph Roth. Okay, yeah, sure. Absolutely. I mean, in Malina, but especially in the story that it's actually a novella, Drei Wege zum See, three ways or paths to the lake, which really creates a double, almost the kind of double of Roth, of Joseph Roth. And in a sense, she kind of make a dialogue with him while negotiating the whole aspect of the nostalgic empire, right? Or nostalgic imagination of the empire as we can find in the novels of Roth, Radetzky, Marsh, and others. But in a sense, Bachmann already lived beyond this myth. And that's why I found it so interesting to see how she tries to, at the same time, it's always like a simultan, the parallel, things that, which I found also later in the two Israeli writers that or Viennese and Israeli writers that I mentioned later, that this intention to look at this linearity, the time concept of, right, the 19th century, the progress, so to say, in a different way. Like to think about it as a texture, as something that interconnects with different layers, and at the same time, but also has like in a polyphonic or much more dialogical context. So in that sense, there is no, it's hard to speak about this kind of binary, right? The present is horrible and the past is kind of pure, right? And also give us something like a consolation or something that we can live up with. In the case of Bachmann, I think she already quite critical about this connection or this kind of things that we find by Roth. So in a way, she is highly influenced by him, but also the figure that it's a kind of the figure that she creates in Drei Wege zum See is a figure that in a way kind of gives her ideas of, you know, critical thinking about the present, but also in a way Bachmann moves a step further and she criticizes not only the present but also the past. So in a way there is an influence, but already she takes a step further, right? She doesn't stay in the place where what has been. Obviously she lived and created in different times, and you can see it also in her book. But absolutely, you are right that there is there all the time, and it's very precise. As to the ancient images and objects and localities, it's very interesting, and I must say that I really have to go further and investigate this and examine it. In the sense, I think that it belonged like her interest in this primary ancient world where it all, like the myth, where it all began, where everything began, so to say. But again, it's quite ambivalent, like her journey to Egypt, to the pyramids in works that I didn't mention here. But you can see it, for example, in the other work from Manners of Death, this Art Project, which called the Francis Proof, which I only mentioned by name. So she goes to these places where she can feel or trace or encounter, so to say, the old ancient world, but she doesn't submerge in it, so to say. Like she encountered it, but with a critical eye. And in a sense, it also belongs, I think, to the whole, the big, so to say, breadth or the link that she makes through the concept of the empire. The empires throughout history. On the one hand, she, as I try to show here, she suggests that in the image of the empire there was this kind of transculturality and multilinguistical instances and so on and so forth. But also she's not naive in the sense, and she also criticized the way we think about these empires and the way this post-imperial imagination kind of moves forth into our ways of thinking. And in that sense, I think she's ambivalent. There is this fascination, but also the criticism. And we have them both simultaneously. That's why it was so important for me to speak about this simultaneous reading, so to say, because I think this is Bachmann. She's not so much, on the one hand, there is this fascination from the myth, from the ancient world, from the empire, the imperial imagination, but not only that. She also knows that there is danger there. And when speaking about criticism with regard to the modern nation states, this ethnic, so to say, dominance and the exclusion of others, there is not a clear cut, a binary between past and present. In a sense, she kind of, then she goes back to this linearity, in a sense. And I think she demonstrates some or illuminates some kinds of threads that you can pull throughout this. But I have to go back again and see exactly, the places of these ancient localities, sites, and more precisely way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes, please. Yes. Feel free to join us. Yes. You're muted, so we cannot hear you. Okay.
And now I'm unmuted. I'm a little bit curious if you sense that she begins to discover the Untertan culture, like Heinrich Mann described it, and if there is some kind of early warning towards the impersonalization of violence embedded in bastard Darwinian definition of nation that actually Sarmis, I don't have the proof yet, Sarmis inspired the rise of National Socialism in Germany. If there is some kind of a sensation of this Untertan, some kind of a basso ostinato that begins to crawl, and if this is a phenomenon that is sensed by her, if there is also a barrier to understanding the rebirth in Israel through the prism of this quite sudden, what Friedrich August von Hayek senses in Germany, the homogenization of thinking that all of a sudden appears, that allows the impersonalization of violence, impersonalization put into, that is violence, intimate violence put into laws and statutes. I'm curious because I'm going to study in depth the hub of three empires interacting in the region of Lublin, Congress Poland. And it is quite intriguing also to understand whether the democratization due to modernization on the Russian side could have inspired some kind of a sense of competition, and also the national mobilization on Habsburgian and Prussian side, if there is anything to it, or this is a phenomenon triggered first by maybe Stalinian homogenization on the Russian side.
Thank you so much. It's really illuminating thought. It's difficult for me to answer because it takes the whole story in in this kind of Russian and this, and also a kind of social political thoughts but looking at Bachmann's literature, and then the way I think that Ruth Almog, for instance, she's much more prominent in the way she kind of borrows or interacts with Bachmann's literary tradition, so to say. So there you can really see a fear or kind of warning against the homogenization of the, so to say, right, the homophonic, the homogeneity voice of the modern nation state, so to say, in a way that it kind of plays a role in excluding others. And in a sense, that what both Almog and I think also Bachmann, they look for encounters between those others that are not in a way part or always see themselves as outside of this hegemonic, so to say, narrative. All of Bachmann's female protagonists or narrators, as I tried to show,
Yes.
they're quite ambivalent with regard to this mono, yes,
Yes.
and in a sense you can see it also in the literature of Ruth Almog, who is quite aware of the cultural, the political, the social circumstances and conditions. It's not that Israel is like Germany or the whole, but in a way, the way those two writers think about this modern nation state in a way that excludes. So I think this is interesting to investigate and examine. And but having said that, it's not a binary, like the empire is good and the modern nation state is bad, or so it's much more, you see it also in the way they play, but in a very serious way, with the doubles, with the literary character, with modes of identification. Celan and Bachmann, the two protagonists in Malina, the two women in Ruth Almog, right? Also, there is all kind of encounters between the victims of the Nazi genocide, right? Both German and Jews, not only Jews, so to say. And they try through the literary side or through the poetic dimension to create those crossroads. And I think this is also what Anna Maria Jokl tries to do. With kind of think about this long histories.
Thank you very much for your reply. It is really embedded. That is the fear of homogenization of views is very outspoken in Friedrich August von Hayek, The Road to Thraldom, The Road to Serfdom, 1944, where he views the cartelization, the modern state and the type of industrial structures as the source of, or let me say, the source of wiping out differences and the danger embedded in that. So he actually sensed the beginning of the calamity in this clagging, that is industrial clagging, and the suppressing of divergent views.
Right. Thank you.
I have two questions. The first is that Bachmann is often associated with lyricism and introspection, and I was wondering, how do you see this inward take that you outlined? Would you say that there is an inherent tension in her work between individual voice and collective experience, or is that more of a product of how her writing has been received and categorized? And my second question is, in the Israeli reception of Bachmann's work, does the Habsburg dimension register meaningfully, or is it overshadowed by other frameworks such as exile, trauma, or gender?
Thank you so much. First, to the first question. Right, it's interesting. I think I chose the examples of Bachmann from the late phase of her life and work, and the prose work that is kind of belonged to this project that she did not complete, right? To the starting project. It's a prose project, and in a sense, she moved away from this, so to say, poetic lyric stances. In the case of Bachmann, it's very interesting because she broke, right, with her first poetry collection in 1954, 53, 54. And then she published her second poetry collection in 57. And critics loved it, yes, especially the first one. And then she published her first prose collection at the beginning of the 60s. This prose collection, which I did not mention, the 30th year. The first story in this collection is kind of autobiographic, autofiction or autobiographic memoir, something in between those. And the critics did not know how to react and how to accept it. What is it? Is it a poem? Is it a prose work? Is it a story? Is it something in between? And then you can really see the move, the transition from poetry to prose, but also in a way that something is happening, which I think is characterized by the way she holds both together. It's not only her interest in music, on which I worked in other plays, but right relationship between music and literature, but also this inability to define, to say exactly what is it there. It also, if you think about it in terms of the structure and poetics, it's also the way you can think about people themselves. The inability, the refusal, not only the inability, the ethical refusal to define, right, to say what it is in a way. and to signify or to sign. And but more to your question, and of course she was regarded as introspect and very complicated, and there was different trends in scholarship when they started to think of her as a feminist writer, and when they started to think of her as someone who deals with trauma, and these all belong to the scholarship regarding Bachmann. But I think what's important to your question is the way in the 60s, and it follows in a way her Frankfurter Vorlesungen, the Frankfurt lectures that she gave on poetics, when she felt that it's time to speak in a way, I wouldn't say in a more clear way, and I would say that there has to be a message, but in a sense, something had to do with the way she felt that the literature has to be a witness to what happens outside of it. And readers must, in a way, feel it. You see it, I think, in her prose, and especially in the Todesabend project, that time and again she's preoccupied with this ethical and cultural, social, psychological aspects and challenges to be a witness to it, to testify to this devastation, which is not only historical but is psychic. And also going back to the question of Sylvia, right? It also has to do with the economical order, of course. The economical, the social, it's not only the historical catastrophe, but the way, in a sense, that what we see continues as a kind of repressive and violence with regard to the people, to the men, and men, women, and here you get her right, her gender reflection and criticism with regard to all kinds of violence. And Adorno also could be mentioned here, whom she read and whom she quotes, and perhaps influence in a way this whole discourse about writing after Auschwitz and the relationship with Celan and Celan with Adorno. So it's all there in the 60s, and Bachmann is part of it. And I think that her literature reflects on these tendencies, that there must be something in the voice, the poetic voice, that testifies to this social, cultural, historical, psychological devastation. So this is to the third question. And with regard to the second one, the Habsburgian Empire, or the it's a good one. I don't see it at the moment. I mean, when reading Ruth Almog, I think it's more, she's interested in the relationship between German and Israelis, second, third generations. So to say the transgenerational problems and challenges, and what will, what will happen in the present, and which will influence the future. What picture of future would we like to see? And she goes back in this sense to investigate the sources in the past, but she's not that interested in the parents or in the grandparents, apropos the Habsburg Empire, but rather in the children, like in the inheritance, what we have now and how we are going to deal with it, to think about it, to try and open it up in order to make things different, perhaps in the future. But then again, through encounters. I think what's important in all these three cases, and when I spoke about the literary tradition of Bachmann, regards to this kind of crossroads and encounters between people, between human beings, between strangers, foreigners, etc., that she kind of crystallizes these moments of speaking together, one to the other. It fades, as in Malina, right? As in the stories that I mentioned, except perhaps for, we don't know, but perhaps for Simultan. That's my question to Giacomo, how to understand this Aguri in the end of the story. Adorni. So here you have again Adorno. I don't know. It's all kinds of things that you can think through them. But I don't see the Habsburgian Empire there. And with Jokl, I think it's more complicated. She's from Vienna, of course, and most of her life she lived in Europe throughout these 6 lives. Only in the end she came to Jerusalem, and then she returned to London. And so with her, I think it's perhaps would be something to look for there, which I haven't done yet. But that would be my next step. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Michal Ben Horin, for your great talk and for your thoughtful answers to our questions. So I think we should end by now. Thank you again, and we're looking forward to see you all next week. We have our last and final lecture in our lecture series given by Dr. Michal Peles Almogor. So thank you again, Professor Michal Ben Horin, for being here today. And I wish you all the best and see you next week.
Thank you so much.